The ice does not forget hands that tremble. It remembers every step taken in fear, every breath stolen by cold, every kindness offered when survival demanded silence. And on the morning this story begins, the ice was already watching him. He had not planned to stop there, not on that stretch of frozen land where the wind carved voices into the snow and the ground groaned like an old animal beneath pressure. Yet his legs failed him before his mind could argue. The hunter, alone, weather-beaten, carrying more years than his body could comfortably hold, collapsed near a ridge of blue ice that rose like a frozen wave. Frost clung to his eyelashes, knitting them together, forcing him to blink slowly, painfully, as if the act of seeing itself had become labor. His breath came out in short, ragged plumes, each one stolen by the wind before it could warm his face. Somewhere beneath his layered furs, his heart beat with a dull, stubborn rhythm, refusing to surrender to the cold despite the ache spreading through his joints. This land had taught him endurance, but it had also taught him humility. No one crossed it without paying a price. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. He built the camp the way his father had taught him decades earlier, with movements that lived deeper than memory. Hands numb but disciplined, he cut blocks of snow with slow precision, stacking them not for beauty, but for shelter that could resist the screaming wind. Each block carried the faint blue of compressed time, ice older than stories, older than names. The small fire he managed to coax from stubborn driftwood crackled weakly, its sound sharp and fragile, like something that could be snuffed out by a single careless breath. As the flames caught, the smell of smoke mixed with salt and cold, stinging his nose, grounding him in the present. He did not pray. He had learned long ago that the ice listened whether one asked or not. Night arrived without ceremony. The sky dimmed into a bruised gradient of gray and violet, and the stars emerged like quiet witnesses rather than guides. Inside the crude shelter, the hunter wrapped himself tighter, muscles aching not just from the cold, but from something older. Regret that settled in his bones the way frost settled into cracks. He had once been part of a larger camp, a larger life, voices and laughter echoing across the ice at dawn. That life had thinned over the years, carried away by accidents, illness, and choices he never learned to forgive himself for. Now, solitude was not a preference, but a condition. The ice did not judge this. It merely held space for it. Sleep came in fragments. He drifted in and out, half aware of the ice shifting beneath him, a deep, resonant sound like distant thunder trapped underground. Each movement reminded him how small he was, how temporary. In one moment of restless waking, he thought he heard footsteps. Soft, careful, many of them, but the wind swallowed the sound before his mind could grasp it. He tightened his grip on the worn knife at his side, not out of fear of people, but of hope. Hope was dangerous in places like this. It could make a man careless. Dawn did not announce itself with light at first, but with silence. The wind eased, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The hunter stirred, muscles stiff, eyes burning as he pushed himself upright. Cold air flooded his lungs, sharp enough to make him wince, but something else followed it. An unfamiliar density in the air, a presence that pressed against the edges of his awareness. When he stepped outside the shelter, snow crunching softly beneath his boots, he froze. Not from the cold, but from what stood before him. Across the ice, arranged in a loose, deliberate arc, were figures. Women wrapped in traditional furs, faces calm, eyes steady. 49 of them. They stood without weapons raised, without haste, their silhouettes dark against the pale horizon. Their breath rose in unison, a shared rhythm that felt older than any single life among them. At the front stood a woman unlike the others. Taller, stiller, her presence seemed to quiet the space around her. Frost traced the edges of her hair, and her gaze met his, not with suspicion, but with recognition, as if she had been walking toward this moment for a very long time. The hunter did not speak. He did not move. He understood, instinctively, that whatever had brought them here was not an accident. The ice had remembered him, and now it had returned something he did not know he was owed. The women did not advance all at once. Only one moved, her steps slow and deliberate, boots pressing shallow marks into the snow that the wind did not erase. Every movement she made carried the weight of permission. She stopped a few paces from the hunter, close enough that he could see the fine lines etched into her face, not by age alone, but by years of listening. To storms, to people, to the ice itself. Her eyes were dark and steady, reflecting neither fear nor curiosity, but something closer to assessment, as if she were measuring not his strength but his capacity to remain standing when truth arrived. The hunter felt suddenly exposed, as though the layers of fur and habit he wore were thin disguises against her gaze. He lowered his eyes slightly, not in submission, but in respect. Among his people, only those who understood loss carried themselves like this. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. She spoke without raising her voice, and yet the sound reached him clearly, carried not by volume, but by intention. Her words were in his language, but shaped by an older rhythm, one that placed pauses where memory lived. She did not ask his name. She told him she already knew it, had known it since before the ice took his brother, since before the night he chose solitude over returning to the camp that reminded him too much of who he used to be. The hunter's chest tightened at the mention, a sharp, contained pain that he had learned to carry without flinching. He did not deny it. Denial was for warmer places. She explained why they had come, not with prophecy or mysticism, but with something far more unsettling, cause and consequence. Weeks earlier, one of their younger hunters had been caught in a whiteout, disoriented, injured, certain he would not survive the night. It was this man, the one now standing before her, who had found him. The hunter remembered the boy vaguely, blood on the snow, a leg twisted at an impossible angle, eyes wide with terror masked by pride. He had shared his fire, his food, and his shelter without asking where the boy came from, without calculating what it would cost him. At dawn, he had helped him onto a sled headed toward the distant line of the women's camp, then turned away before gratitude could be spoken. Kindness, the woman explained, does not dissipate in the cold. It travels. It gathers witnesses. As she spoke, the other women remained still, but the hunter felt them listening, not only to her words, but to him, to the way his shoulders rose and fell, to the subtle tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with temperature. He realized then that this was not a confrontation. It was an accounting. Each of the 49 women represented a life intertwined with that boy's survival. Mothers, sisters, daughters, partners, elders. They had come not to thank him, but to answer an imbalance the ice itself had marked. The woman stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint trace of seal oil and smoke on her clothing. She told him they knew about his isolation, about the years he had spent moving from camp to camp, never staying long enough to be folded back into community. They knew he believed himself dangerous to those who grew close, as if loss were contagious. Her voice did not accuse. It observed. And in that observation, the hunter felt something loosen, something he had kept rigid out of necessity rather than truth. She then did something unexpected. She reached into her pack and placed a small, carefully wrapped bundle at his feet. Inside were supplies, food, medicinal herbs, repair tools, far more than what one person would offer out of courtesy. It was provision, continuity, a statement that his survival mattered beyond his own stubborn will. The hunter swallowed hard, his throat burning more fiercely than the cold ever could. Accepting aid felt more dangerous than giving it. It required trust in a future he had stopped imagining. Around them, the light shifted. The sun climbed higher, catching the edges of ice crystals and scattering them into brief, blinding flashes. The camp no longer felt temporary. It felt witnessed. The hunter realized that whatever choice he made next would ripple outward, just as his single act of kindness had. The woman waited, patient as the land itself, giving him space to decide whether he would remain a man who passed through lives unseen or one who allowed himself to be remembered. He knelt slowly, joints protesting, and accepted the bundle. Not with words, but with the quiet nod of someone who finally understood that survival was not only about endurance. Sometimes it was about staying. The women did not leave when he accepted the bundle. They stayed, as if waiting for something older than agreement to settle into place. The ice beneath them all creaked softly, a low sound of pressure adjusting rather than warning. The hunter rose with effort, the stiffness in his body reminding him how long he had lived without hands to steady him or voices to soften the edges of days. He gestured toward the fire, small and imperfect, and for the first time since he built the camp, it felt inadequate, not because it could not warm them, but because warmth, he realized, was no longer the point. One by one, the women approached, not crowding him, not surrounding him, but closing the distance in a way that respected space while dissolving isolation. Snow brushed against their boots, the sound muted, intimate, as if the land itself were listening carefully. The woman who had spoken first remained slightly apart, watching him with an expression that carried neither relief nor triumph. This was not a rescue. It was a return. She told him they would stay until the sun climbed fully, until the ice had finished what it was doing beneath their feet. She spoke of timing the way others spoke of weather, not as something to fight, but something to understand. The hunter nodded, though he did not fully grasp what was unfolding. Understanding, he suspected, would come later, after the body caught up with the moment. They shared food without ceremony. Dried meat passed from hand to hand, broth warmed over the fire thick with fat and herbs, the steam rising slowly, clinging to eyelashes and hair before vanishing. As he drank, heat spread through his chest in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. He had grown used to eating only enough to move forward, never enough to rest. Across from him, one of the younger women met his eyes briefly and smiled. Not gratitude, but recognition. The kind that says, "I see the shape of your silence because I carry one too." As the morning stretched on, stories emerged, not told directly, not shaped into neat narratives, but woven through small observations and shared tasks. Someone repaired a tear in his shelter wall without asking. Another adjusted the fire so the smoke pulled cleanly away. These gestures carried weight precisely because they were unspoken. The hunter felt the slow erosion of a belief he had lived with for years, that needing nothing was the same as being strong. The ice had supported that belief for a long time. Now it seemed to be letting it crack. At one point, the woman approached him again, her steps soundless on the snow. She spoke of his brother, not of the accident itself, but of the days before it, of laughter remembered by others, of a man who had been more than the moment he disappeared into the ice. The hunter closed his eyes as she spoke, breath hitching despite his efforts to remain still. He had feared that keeping his brother alive in memory would anchor him to pain. Instead, he felt something else settle in, a sense that loss did not erase connection. It transformed it. The women did not ask him to come back with them. They did not offer absolution or promises. What they offered was more difficult, presence without demand. The hunter realized that this, too, was a form of survival, allowing oneself to be witnessed without performance, without explanation. When the sun finally broke fully above the horizon, bathing the ice in pale gold, the women began to prepare to leave. Their movements were unhurried, respectful of the quiet that had formed between them. Before departing, the woman paused in front of him once more. She told him the camp would remain where it was, and that paths, once reopened, had a way of staying visible longer than one expected. Then she turned, joining the others as they moved back across the ice, their figures gradually dissolving into the brightness. The hunter stood alone again, but the silence felt different now, less like absence, more like space. As he returned to the fire, tending it with steady hands, he understood that something fundamental had shifted. The ice had not changed. The cold had not softened. But he had been reminded that survival, at its deepest level, was not a solitary act, and that some kindnesses, once released, come back not as echoes, but as people. The women vanished into the brightness without sound. No farewell was spoken, because farewells assume separation is final. What remained was heavier than absence. The hunter stood for a long time after they were gone, the cold creeping back into the spaces their presence had briefly warmed. His breath slowed, no longer ragged, but measured, as if his body were recalibrating to a different understanding of time. The camp looked unchanged, same uneven blocks of snow, same fire reduced to a bed of glowing embers, but it no longer felt provisional. The ice beneath his boots seemed steadier, not because it had thickened, but because he had stopped treating every moment as temporary. Staying, he realized, required more courage than leaving ever had. He moved deliberately, packing the supplies they had given him, hands no longer shaking. Each item carried intention, not charity. As he worked, memories surfaced uninvited. His brother laughing as they hauled a seal across the ice, the sound sharp and bright against the wind. The argument that sent him out alone that final morning, words thrown like stones and never retrieved. For years he had believed solitude was penance, that distance was a form of respect for the dead. Now that belief felt thin, worn through by repetition. The woman's words lingered, not accusatory, not forgiving, simply factual. Loss did not absolve one from living. The ice spoke again beneath him, a long, resonant groan that vibrated through his legs and into his chest. He paused, listening, as his father once taught him to do. Not every sound was a warning. Some were adjustments, reminders that even the strongest surfaces were always in motion. He felt a strange alignment then, between the shifting land and the slow shift inside himself. Both resisted sudden change. Both responded better to patience than force. As the day wore on, he ventured farther from the camp than he had planned, following a line of snowdrifts toward higher ground. From there, he could see the faint path the women had taken, already softening under drifting snow, but not yet erased. He imagined walking it, not today, not tomorrow, but soon. The thought did not tighten his chest the way it once would have. Instead, it brought a cautious warmth, the kind that does not promise comfort, but offers continuity. He had spent years surviving between places. Now, the idea of arriving somewhere no longer felt like surrender. He returned to the camp at dusk, the sky dimming into familiar hues of gray and indigo. As he rebuilt the fire, feeding it carefully, he noticed how his movements had changed. Less hurried, less defensive. The wind returned, brushing the shelter walls, testing their seams. He welcomed the sound. It reminded him that endurance was still necessary, that connection did not make the ice gentle. It made the cold bearable. That night, sleep came deeper. Dreams carried faces without sharp edges, voices without accusation. When he woke, heart steady, he understood that the women had not come to save him from the ice. They had come to save him from believing he deserved nothing more than endurance. Outside, the fire still burned low but steady, a thin line of smoke threading upward into the dark. He tended it, not out of fear of extinction, but out of care. The ice had given him many lessons over the years. The hardest one, it seemed, came now, not about how to survive alone, but about how to remain when leaving was easier. He sat with that knowledge, letting it settle, aware that dawn would bring another choice, and that this time he might walk toward it instead of away. Dawn returned quietly, without spectacle. No crowd stood waiting this time, no figures arranged against the horizon. And yet, the ice felt less empty than it ever had before. The hunter woke before the light fully arrived, his body responding to the subtle shift in the air rather than habit or fear. The cold was still there, sharp, uncompromising, but it no longer felt like an adversary. It felt like a condition of living, something to move with rather than against. As he stepped outside the shelter, snow whispering under his boots, he noticed the fire's embers still glowing faintly, stubbornly alive through the night. He knelt, feeding it slowly, watching the flames strengthen. It reminded him that endurance did not always roar. Sometimes it waited. He packed what he needed and left what he did not. This time the act was intentional. He marked the camp carefully, not as a final resting place, but as a point of return. When he turned toward the distant path, now softened but still discernible beneath fresh snow, he felt the familiar weight of solitude lift just enough to let breath move freely through his chest. He was not walking toward answers. He was walking toward people who understood the cost of survival because they lived it, not because they spoke of it. The journey was slow. His body reminded him of its limits with every step, joints aching, muscles protesting. But there was no panic in the pain. The land unfolded as it always had, wide, indifferent, beautiful in its restraint. He passed familiar landmarks that had once signaled isolation and now felt like waypoints, quiet markers of continuity. When he paused to rest, he did not feel watched in the way that breeds fear. He felt held in the way that allows movement to resume. As the camp came into view hours later, faint shapes against the ice, he stopped. Not because he was unsure, but because the moment deserved weight. He remembered the woman's face, the steadiness of her gaze, the absence of demand in her voice. He understood now that what she had offered was not forgiveness or redemption, but belonging without condition. He exhaled slowly and continued forward. They saw him before he reached the edge. No one rushed to meet him. No one turned away. Space was made, as it had been for him at the ice camp, a deliberate widening rather than an enclosure. The woman stood among them, meeting his eyes once more. This time she nodded, not as an invitation, but as acknowledgement. He had chosen to stay. That was enough. As he settled among them, helping with tasks, listening more than speaking, the rhythm of shared work filled the spaces words never could. Smoke rose from multiple fires, carrying the familiar scent of food and warmth into the cold air. Children moved between adults, laughter brief but real. The hunter felt the ache of memory, but it no longer cut. It grounded. When night fell again, he lay beneath the open sky, stars sharp and numerous, the ice murmuring softly beneath the camp. He understood then that the land had not changed him through punishment or trial, but through relationship, through reminding him that survival is a collective memory, carried forward by those willing to stand when kindness returns. The ice would continue to remember, and now, so would he.